Hello, good morning and good afternoon. It's so great to see so many people joining us today for this session. My name is Rob Hunter. I'm a senior research analyst at Access Lex. And joining me today are several colleagues and friends who are going to be talking to us about program assessments. And as you can see, the name of our presentation is How Did You Even Begin? Stories from starting a program assessment. And the modifier even is doing a lot of important work in that title because we want to address questions and concerns and curiosity that you have about program assessment and program evaluation. What is it? What is it for? How can it help you? How can it help your students? I'd like to briefly describe the functionality of the platform that we're using here. If you have questions, please type them into the Q&A box. We will have an opportunity for a general Q&A discussion after both of our teams have delivered their presentations today. If you are having any technical difficulties, you can also submit a question that way, and either I or my colleague, Kamisha Little, will respond. And without further ado, let's get started. So just a brief quote from the poet Avrajani. First steps are always the hardest, but until they are taken, the notion of progress remains only a notion and not an achievement. And we're very interested to help you take those first steps today. And attending this webinar is one of those first steps. I'd like to briefly touch on sort of three pillars that are going to support today's discussions, and we're going to return to them more than once. When you are first starting out, planning, thinking about program evaluation, thinking about assessing an intervention at your law school, there are sort of three core pillars to focus on. First is quite simply deciding where to start. And this is something that all of our presenters will be discussing. It's both a simple and yet not so simple consideration, and it's really important to give some careful thought about how and where you're going to start. And we will expand upon this and make it more concrete over the course of the next hour. The second pillar, assembling a team and gathering resources. Again, this is very straightforward, but it's also crucial and essential, and we're going to give you some considerations, some options to think about how you can marshal resources, whom you can reach out to, what are the tools that you might need or that you may already have. And then finally, of course, the third pillar is actually launching the assessments. This is a question of logistics, it's a question of leadership, and it's a question of thoroughly familiarizing yourself with everything that falls under the first two pillars. Our first presentation is going to be from our colleagues at Elon University School of Law and New England Law in Boston. They are Wendy Scott, the Associate Dean for Academic Success and Professor of Law at Elon University, and Chris Leopold, a Professor of Psychology at Elon University. They will be discussing the evaluation of Elon's academic and bar success programs. And I invite them to take it away. Wendy, I'm sorry, I think that you're on mute.
My name is Wendy Scott, and I'm happy to be here today. I appreciate the invitation from Access Lex, and I am going to do the first part of our presentation, which will focus on the two pillars that Rob laid out, and then Chris, my colleague, will move into the launching the assessment pillar. So let me just give a little bit of backdrop. When I joined the law school in 2018, we were finishing up a quantitative review of our bar program by looking at the courses, the bar prep courses, both doctrinal and the programmatic courses that our Office of Academic Success, or OAS, were teaching, to see if there was some correlation between bar passage and the courses taken in law school. We also looked at the pass rates by bar company and several other quantitative measures to determine if we needed to make changes to our curriculum, if we needed to recommend specific bar companies. And so as a result of that study, we were able to actually make some curricular changes and respond to the data that we received. And that was a project that was funded by Access Lex. But I'm not a social scientist. I'm not a numbers person. I like to know more about the qualitative reasons that people are successful or not in law school and in taking the bar exam. And so the dean and I got into a conversation about that. He was looking to maybe do some measures of qualitative aspects of law school. In particular, what do students do with their time outside of the classroom? You know, how are they studying? We know some of that data comes from LESI, but we wanted to look a little deeper. And so we designed a proposal that we submitted to Access Lex to develop interventions for improving success in law school by looking at the study habits of current students, surveying our graduates before and after as they prepared for the bar, and then interviewing alumni about their experience. We were already doing some surveys of our students before and after they graduated, but Chris will talk a little bit more about making those surveys more robust and more tailored to the purpose that we had agreed upon for this project, which we have called Breaking Down Barriers. We place particular emphasis on historically underrepresented minority students and students who come from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, although our research encompasses all students. And again, Chris can talk about how he tailored the research instruments and tools to capture the entire student body experience, but with some particular emphasis on this category of students. The project is funded by Access Lex, and we're in phase 2 of the project, which has taken a little longer than we thought, but we want to make sure that our data tells us what we need to know, and that we have taken the appropriate amount of time and surveyed and interviewed the appropriate number of people for the data to be meaningful. So, deciding to start, as I said, the dean and I were having conversations. We had some qualitative data, but we wanted to burrow down a little deeper to look for unique challenges that some of our students of color may have. And sometimes, you discover what you already know, but it's also important to confirm what you believe you know, or find out that maybe you don't know everything that may be significant to student success. And so we're looking at existing interventions. For instance, our bar mentoring program is one of the existing interventions that we're looking at to see how effective that is, and then hoping to develop new interventions based on the data that we collect. And I would say not just the data that we're collecting now, the qualitative data, but coupling that with the quantitative data that we already have, and having a more holistic picture. So finding the resources and assembling a team, we submitted our application to Access Lex for a directed grant program, funding. I was charged to manage the project and identify people to serve as an advisory committee that would help us to identify those barriers. Now, to me, it's very important for us to recognize our limitations. And as I said, I am not a social scientist. I'm not trained to do empirical research. And so I wanted to make sure that we had people on our advisory team that were. And so when we put together our advisory team, we had people from across the campus at Elon, as well as people from other law schools. And so you can see that there were law professors on the team, but we also had the dean for the School of Education. We had the dean for the School of Communications. We had a professor, now department chair, Dr. David Buck, who is also working with us on the research side. We have a local attorney who has consulted with us for several years, serving as mentors for bar students. So bar studies, she has insight into our student body. She's working with us as a consultant. We also had another member of our OAS staff on the team, as well as the vice president for the newly formed Division of Inclusive Excellence on main campus. So I think it's important to have an expansive perspective. I didn't know Dr. David Buck. I went online. I said, gee, we need somebody from the psychology department. And I knew Chris, but when I looked at the research that Dr. Buck was doing, I'm like, he would probably be a good person to be on our team, because he's looking at students who are considered disenfranchised. Some of his research focuses on the LGBT community. And so looking at people's resumes, Dean Bierman had worked with Jerry Organ before and Olympia Duhart. So the two of us sort of put our heads together and came up with what I think was a very good team. Now, we put the team to work. And so over the summer, we had our first meeting in June, and between June and August, we broke that group down into 4 small groups to start a conversation about barriers to success and possible interventions and what data we would need. So I was very pleased with the commitment of this group. They met. We came back together in September. They presented their meeting discussions, and from that we were able to assemble what this group of experts believed were potential barriers to success. I then invited Dr. Buck and Dr. Leopold, as well as Shane Orr, and Shane had worked on our previous grant. Shane is a data analyst. He worked with us when we were doing the quantitative research, and so he was familiar with Elon. Again, he had run numbers for us. He had a big picture view of our student body, and so I invited the 3 of them to be our research team. Some of the information that they started with from the work of the committees were financial constraints, family challenges, the imposter syndrome, lack of generational knowledge of the methods of legal education, the profession, especially among first-generation students. So as I said before, it's not as if we were never aware of these as possible constraints, but we wanted to find out how they affected our student body. And so once the committees were able to identify these barriers, then we were able to get to work and launch our assessment. And as I said, we're looking at current as well as developing new interventions. The current, our bar mentoring program, and also our postgraduate final approach program, and our new 2L Bar Edge program. Those are interventions that we're assessing, but of course we're hoping that perhaps there'll be some new interventions that will flow from the research. So I am now going to turn the presentation over to Chris, who will talk about launching the assessment and where we are in phase 2.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Wendy. Everybody, thank you for having us here. My name is Chris Leopold. I am actually an industrial organizational psychologist, so I am not a lawyer. I started my career in management consulting, where I did a lot of performance assessment and designing systems for organizations to hire people and so forth. And my role at the law school has usually focused on developing leadership and professional development competencies. So I was really excited to be part of this, kind of going back into my roots of performance assessment and prediction and so forth. So David and Shane and I, when we got ready to do this, we sat down and tried to map out as comprehensive a plan as we could get. And we had a number of partners here. Of course, Wendy's office has been doing a lot over the last few years in particular. We also had, of course, we went right to students for the data. Current 3Ls who are recently graduated 3Ls, we wanted to get their perspectives on preparing for the bar exam and some other variables. We also wanted to begin looking at habits of 2L students now. I'll explain how a lot of this has really been developed to be a longitudinal type study, so we can measure students at multiple points over time. We also involve bar mentors, the bar mentor program, where students work with a mentor that they check in. We wanted feedback from them. How are the students doing? What are they doing? And then finally, we also wanted to talk to alums because they've been through it now, and they might have additional information about the factors that help them pass. We used a multi-method approach, as we social scientists would call it. We looked at some historical data that had been collected, and Wendy's team had done quite a bit of data gathering. We took that. We also created surveys. I am a quantitative person by nature, so we wanted some good quantitative data from surveys. And then, of course, the qualitative, as Wendy mentioned, through interviews. So what we did is, first thing, we looked at the data that we had, and we looked at the instruments that had been used. We kind of culled through, decided which ones we thought were good based on some literature review of previous studies, not just on law school student success, but also medical school, graduate school, other people in those types of programs to see what sorts of things work. We also looked at things that tend to predict success in employment settings. There's certain variables that just generally predict well for everything. So we did that, and then we created a series of surveys, essentially kind of waves. There was a lot going on. I think that early in the beginning, the first slide, something about starting is the hardest part, and that was certainly for us. We have all these things we want to gather. Where do we begin? So we looked at all of the information that we had. We decided on what variables we would want to measure. We looked at the instruments that have been used. We looked at things like reliability and validity, things that get us psychologists really excited. So I want to drill down a little bit more so you can see specifically what we did. So for the 3L students, we had them complete 3 assessments, and this was last fall. We did all of our surveys through the Qualtrics platform, which is a very flexible and very powerful platform. And one of the big things I think for us underlying our goal to identify some of the factors, we also wanted to build a set kind of platform going forward so we can continue to gather data each year over time for each student, just because that just gives so much more information. Statistically, you can do a lot of other things. So with the 3Ls, the first thing we did in November, Wendy taught a preparing for the bar type class. We did a survey, and this was really around their mindset. Are they thinking about the bar? Have they thought about where they're going to study? Have they thought about child care or family obligations and so on and so forth? So it's really to get them into the mindset. The second thing we looked at was what I'll call dispositional or kind of trait or personality type factors that typically predict pretty well in other arenas that are related to performance. So we decided we would begin to look at some of those. And then after they took the bar exam, a couple weeks after, to let some of the emotion go, we asked them for their reflections on the bar exam. What were some of the factors they thought were most helpful? What would they have done differently, and so on. So here's, again, drilling down even into more specifics so you can see what we actually got at. So I mentioned for the preparing for the bar exam, this was the mindset. We also asked them if they were going to participate in the bar mentor program, and if so, they would have a choice of who they would like to serve as their mentor. The dispositional factors, this was about right around graduation time. And a lot of these may look familiar to you. Some of these, as I said, are used a lot in organizations, things like perceived support. So there were questions like, I consistently receive support from my advisor, or I have fellow classmates whom I can speak to about issues. We looked at things like self-efficacy, which is basically the extent to which you believe you can do something. I have confidence when I take an exam. Growth mindset has to do with one's sort of perspective on whether or not you can change in intelligence. So questions like, intelligence is pretty much fixed and there's really nothing you can do about it, versus, if you work hard, you can improve your knowledge. Self-regulated learning, we asked about the techniques that they used. There were other questions about what sorts of things distracted them and how they mitigated that. We had questions about resilience and being able to bounce back and test anxiety. All of these were previously established scales that we used, so they had good reliability and validity coefficients, and we pretty much used them. We tailored them just a little bit to make it, instead of like my work setting, we would say my law school. And then finally, after the bar exam, we asked them some of the same questions, but we tailored it while I was preparing for the bar. I was confident I would be able to do this. As I was preparing for the bar, I had, mentors and, other people to support me, that sort of thing. We also asked them their perspectives on the bar mentor program, if they did it. Many students, I think most students did. We'd ask them, what was effective, what worked on that. We asked them questions about their study habits. Where did they study? Was it on the computer? Was it on paper? What percentage of questions did you complete? And so on and so forth. So we got a lot of data from the 3Ls in a short amount of time. We also have information from the bar mentors. So these were the people meeting with the students while they were preparing for the bar. They would submit weekly reports. They were short, but they would comment on the students' progress, are they where they need to be, any concerns that the mentor had. They would also include general observations. The person is particularly stressed out this week, or they're concerned that they have a sick child, whatever it might be. So we have some good qualitative data there. With the 2L students, we asked them those same disposition type questions. things like self-regulation and self-efficacy and growth mindset and so forth. This will give us information to see, what, if anything, changes from year to year. And for all of these things, there are interventions. If we find that they do predict bar passage, there are interventions that you can do to increase support or reduce anxiety. And that's sort of what we're looking for. Hopefully we'll find things that we can target. Once they completed that, they got a series of follow-up surveys, very brief ones about sleeping habits, just lifestyle, personal care, how much sleep are you getting, how many hours are you studying per week, do you have outside obligations around work. So they would just do this, very quickly. So we want to get some information in terms of what are students doing. And the diary approach gives us more information that we'll be able to use more effectively. Finally, the last piece, we're still in the process of interviewing alums, and we got with Wendy's office and we identified students. We wanted a cross-section of students. We wanted students who passed on the first time. We wanted students who didn't pass on the first time but passed on the second time. We have students from the top quartile. We have students from the bottom quartile. We want a cross-representation of students and asking them, what helped you most studying for the bar exam, or what would you do differently, or what advice would you have? And I have to say, this was a nice bonus benefit. Our alums really, really appreciated being involved in this. One, that we're focusing on it, and two, that we are going to them. It was certainly a good internal marketing thing for us. And they're pretty extensive, 45 minutes or so. Some of them went an hour and a half. People had a lot of information to share. So general observations and challenges, I'll wrap up. One, I think the data that we collected, I feel good about it. We used all of the best practices that a psychologist, a social scientist would. All of the instruments have reliability and validity. I think we covered just about everything we possibly could. Participation was very good. I think the 3L surveys, the first couple were 90%, participative. Students, again, appreciated that we're trying to do this. The 2Ls were a little bit harder to get. So we're going to collect another sample in the fall on them. As I said, everybody was really appreciative we're doing this. For us as social scientists and statisticians, as I said, we have everything the way we want it. And that was one of the things that we didn't quite have before. Each year things were a little bit different. They were close, but it's very hard to go year to year when you have different instruments. But we have that now. And this will allow us to continue to measure students. We could even use the dispositional scale or surveys on study habits for 1Ls. And that just allows so many more things you can do with statistics to find something here. In terms of criticisms, anytime you do self-report biases, surveys, you're going to get self-report biases. A student may think they studied 10 hours that day. You really may have been like 4.5, but we're doing what we can there. Of course, Elon, we're using our students. It would be wonderful if our work generalized to other schools, but we'll see. Right now, we're going to see what we get. Certainly lots of moving parts. All surveys were going on, different classes, different versions. Everything went through the institutional review board. But again, we're there. Sample sizes, unfortunately, we always wish we suffer from this a lot in social sciences with quantitative research. When you have groups where the sample sizes are just lower, it's harder to do things. We're going to do what we can and account for that. But in a perfect world, we would have thousands of students. And then the last thing, ultimately, our outcome variable, passing the bar. Statistically, it would be really nice if we could get the actual score that students got. We're stuck with, right now, a pass or a no pass. And that just makes it a little bit harder to assess the effectiveness of these predictors. So anyway, that is a somewhat quick but detailed overview, I hope, in terms of what we've done I think we're in good position, and we've got all this data, and now we'll be able to begin to look for patterns and themes. Okay, thank you very, very much.
Okay, thank you both Wendy and Chris. That was great, and an excellent introduction to everything that we're here to talk about today. I've already received several great questions through the Q&A box, so I encourage all of our attendees to send questions that way. I am gathering them right now and really looking forward to the robust discussion that we're going to have. But first, we have our second presentation from New England Law. We're being joined by Nicole Noel, who is the Director of Academic Excellence Programs at New England, as well as Chance Meyer, a lecturer at New England Law, and really excited to hand the baton over to them because there's great overlap between these two presentations. They're both important in their own right, but there's some complementarity between what we just heard and what we're about to hear, and I think that you're really going to get a lot out of it. So their presentation is evidence-based practices for measurable impacts on student outcomes. So Nicole and Chance, please take it away.
Thanks so much, Rob, and thank you, Chris and Wendy. That was fascinating. We're learning stuff today, too. So our approach to program evaluation is to conceive of it as evidence-based practice. We're trying to take an evidence-based practice approach. So today we're going to give you kind of a 30,000-foot view of what educational evidence-based practice looks like, what it entails, our experience with it, give you some examples of that. And in this, you'll hear pieces, as you did in Chris and Wendy's talk, of design thinking, systems thinking, cognitive learning science, also situated learning theory, trying to draw broadly from the learning sciences, and data science, defining our outcome variables, figuring out our best measures of those variables, and trying to isolate the impact that our teaching activities are having on the student outcomes we care about. That's what this is all about. And also over time, trying to take a kind of continuous improvement approach where our evaluation of our program is ongoing over time and happens in cycles.
Yeah, so a big theme for us is improvement science, continuous iteration. We wanted to create capacities within our department where we can repeat this work year to year for continuous improvement over time, recognizing that our environment is always changing. And that the most effective way to adapt to that is to be also constantly changing and improving. And we did that because we determined from the research that the most effective program evaluation will be ongoing and recursive. So it's embedded in our daily thinking, in our daily work. These concepts filter down to our granular decisions and activities, down to our conception of our work, our discourse, the conversations that we have, the two of us, every aspect of the program. So for us, program evaluation is not a one and done kind of thing. There's no beginning, middle, and end. It's a continuous process where each stage informs the other stages and feeds back into the whole. And really for us, evidence-based practice has become what it is to be an effective teacher, to affect outcomes and know that we are affecting outcomes and how much we're able to affect outcomes. So you evaluate, you redesign based on that evaluation, and then you implement the redesign, and then you evaluate again, and it just keeps going round and round. So it's important to think of program evaluation not as a snapshot so much as it is an emergent, ongoing process of reflection and iteration. And now I know it's probably going to seem like what we're suggesting is impossible, right? We're teaching, we're meeting with students, we're grading, we're going to faculty meetings, how are we supposed to accomplish all this at the same time? But actually, engaging in this process ends up streamlining things. It ends up directing your decision-making, narrowing your focus to the teaching activities that are the most effective. So continuous iteration allows you to eliminate activities that are less effective and frees up institutional resources and time and optimizes your impact. So what you're left with is just the most high value teaching activities and assessments with the greatest effect on outcomes. And it really does ultimately make your life easier. So taking an evidence-based approach to program evaluation, first, we develop design principles, and these are drawn from a literature review and as Chance mentioned, from the learning sciences. And once you develop these principles, you really have to commit to them. And for us, what that means is we don't just treat them like a mission statement. They aren't just set it and forget it. They're touchstones that you evoke in your daily conversations about all things, big and small, large and small decisions on course design, how to handle situations that arise. Chance and I often remind each other in our daily conversations of which design principle applies to the situation that we're addressing in the moment, just to make sure that we're constantly couching our shared thinking in this iterative process.
So with those design principles laid out, after that first step, you want to identify your outcomes that you care about. An evidence-based approach requires us to do that. And this requires some tough decisions because there's a lot of things we care about, right? Everything from bar passage to things like professional identity formation, soft skills, all these things that we care about. But we believe if a program's about everything, it's about nothing, right? You have to at some point decide what you're going to focus on with the limited time you have with your students to actually have an impact. So identifying outcomes, and then once you have those, trying to define your best measures of those outcomes. Some of these are going to be obvious. Best measure of bar pass is bar pass, right? Some of them end up being really difficult. We'll talk about one of our outcomes is the objectivity of a student's self-assessment, right? And so you can think you can imagine it can be a difficult thing to measure, and we've come up with a way of doing that as good as we can. And we kind of want to point out at this point in your sort of launch process, if you have a team involved, is usually the point where somebody's going to say something like, well, not everything can be measured. Numbers aren't everything. I understand where that comes from, but usually this is based on a kind of misunderstanding of what we mean by measurement. So I think it's worth kind of pointing this out. Now, when we say measurement, what we mean is minimizing uncertainty. Right, minimizing uncertainty. It's not that we imagine we can absolutely measure some of them very elusive variables. It's just that we know a disciplined approach to measurement is going to be more reliable than our own intuitions and impressions, because we have a mountain of research telling us that teacher intuitions and impressions are notoriously unreliable and biased. And so to try to be as equitable and effective as we can, we want to try to take a disciplined approach to figuring out whether or not and how much we're affecting the student outcomes we care about. The key point here in this kind of launching an initiative is really just having everyone agree in advance. What is the definition of success? What are the outcomes we care about, and how are we measuring them? So that evaluation doesn't become kind of a free-for-all where everyone has their own definition. That's a danger. That can happen really easily in an organization. Also, you can get these sort of program evaluations that's like a professor sitting in on someone else's class, right? Without the kind of context of the full course design and the shared experience that has come before in that learning community, in that learning environment, shared understandings, values, expectations. It's a very difficult way, a simplistic way to assess something that's really complex. Or you can get these kind of program evaluations that are sort of like 1980s factory floor kind of management style evaluation, where instead of measuring impact on student outcomes, you're sort of counting like counting how many students someone has, how many courses they teach, how many papers they grade, how many meetings they do, how many hours they're in things like that, things that we kind of treat as a proxy for measuring these outcomes, but they aren't really themselves what we care about, So evidence-based practice also gives us a way of really getting at what we care about, which is the student outcomes. So that's the conceptual framework that we have for launching an initiative. And now let's kind of shift into telling you what our experience was with this and try to give you some examples of how this works.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, the first step in an evidence-based program evaluation is defining your design principles, right? You have to moor your thinking, to anchor your thinking, to focus your decision-making. And our principles, which we took from experts like the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching and other sources, are first, number one, we can't improve what we don't measure. So we know from the research that, and as Chance had mentioned, that teacher impressions are unreliable and they're biased. And so we have to rely on measurement. Otherwise, we'll never know what's working and what's not. Number two is don't ask what works. Ask what works, for whom, under what conditions, right? And that's where kind of the situative learning theory comes in. We know from the research that context mediates learning, right? Context mediates learning. So having sound teaching methods isn't enough. We also need to investigate how features of our learning environment interact with our learner characteristics. Number three, improve through failure. Yeah, I said it. That's one of those words that we all tend to try to avoid, one of those F words that we try to avoid. Failure, right? We instinctively want to avoid it, but it's an integral part of the process. Surely not everything we do as teachers will work all the time. That's just the reality. So we need to know, though, what does and what doesn't work and fail forward and leverage that, lean into that and leverage that failure for improvement. Number four, make the work problem specific. So as Chance mentioned, unfortunately, a program that tries to do everything does nothing well. The research tells us that we, as an ASP department, in academic support, we have a huge challenge already in just improving problem solving in a transferable way. And that challenge alone is monumental. So it's more than enough. And so we anchor our work to that goal. As we know, our students face many, many challenges. And so our message is, we're going to make you so good at this that you'll succeed no matter what stands in your way. And then we show them the evidence of their improvement so that they can actually see that what they're doing is working. And so that's how we empower our students to persevere through those difficulties and succeed, while also not denying or ignoring the reality of the challenges that they face. And then lastly, number five, it all comes back to this. It's about student outcomes. Since our challenge is so great, we really need to avoid mission creep. And so for us, it's not about proving how hard we're working or how many meetings we're doing. It's really it's all about actually impacting student outcomes.
So those are our design principles. We took those and decided what are our key outcomes. We're an ASP department, so GPA improvement. That's number one for us. We focused in this evaluation on a third term course, but we have programming in the first year, second year. And so GPA improvement, probably our best measure of legal problem solving ability or change in legal problem solving ability. And then I mentioned this before, objective self-assessment, because our review of the learning science tells us really clearly that this is a precondition to improvement at a problem-solving task like legal analysis. So we all know that there's this catch-22 in education, right, where the less competent a learner is, the less likely they are to appreciate their need for improvement. We don't know what we don't know, right? All of us, myself included, all of us here. So underperformers are sort of disproportionately overconfident in that way. It's just part of the human condition. They assess their work more forgivingly. They practice what's called preservation of self-worth more than high performers. They reach for external attributions more than high performers. These are the things we're up against. These unrealistic judgments of learning make them resistant to feedback, resistant to interventions. This is a barrier we need to break down for our interventions and our feedback to work. From a design perspective, we knew this was something we need to very much be focusing on. And sort of spoiler alert, what our data kind of ends up telling us on this was, yeah, this might be the entire ballgame. You crack this and you might crack legal reasoning itself. Good luck finding a variable that's more predictive of improvement. That's all I have to say about that. So those are our two outcomes that we were focusing on. Of course, those are going to play into bar passage for obvious reasons. Then we needed to define best measures. Our best measure of GPA improvement. Here's an example just of how you kind of have to really think about what it is you're measuring. It's not cumulative GPA, right? That factors in prior improvement. It's not change in cumulative GPA, because then prior improvement is factored into that outcome, So what we ended up using for this was incoming CGPA, incoming cumulative, the best measure of their performance, overall performance up to that point, and then term GPA when we got done with them. The difference in those two is how we defined that outcome, how we operationalized that outcome variable. Okay, then the objective self-assessment. Oh, by the way, we then used that measure. We took that same measure for students who did not take our course and compared their improvement. We sort of had a control group because this is a elective course. So that was very useful in all this. Then our outcome of objective self-assessment. How do you measure this? What we did was we trained our students to be graders. We spent some time on this. We trained them to be graders. We trained them in kind of metacognitive awareness, the sort of things I just explained about the difficulty of self-assessment, as part of the human condition. We shared that with them. We shared the science with them. When they did each of our essays, we then gave them our rubric and had them grade themselves. Then we graded them. And we told them in advance, if they got within a certain number of points, then they would get bonus points on the essay. So they were incentivized to try to grade themselves as objectively as possible. And then we could look over time at how that changed. We call it their self-assessment differential, the difference in their self-score and their earned score, the self-assessment differential. Okay, those were our two outcomes. That's how we measured them. Moving on from kind of our launch, our design to implementation, just a quick list here of the kind of things that we realized we had to develop. We tried to develop as much of this stuff in our department as we possibly could. I'm in a doctoral program at Vanderbilt, so I can bring in some of these as a generalist. It's an EDD program. Bring in some basic data science, basic learning science that we can try to put into practice and run by peers and other experts to make sure that we're not getting too off the mark with this stuff. But it certainly takes basic cognitive learning science. You at least need the useful takeaways from that, right? You don't have to be an expert, don't have to be a scientist, but you need the basics, the retrieval practice, schema development, hypercorrection effect, things like this that are just the kind of top line useful takeaways from the cognitive science about how an individual learner learns. And then also situated learning theory. As Professor Noel mentioned, context mediates learning. Study after study tells us this. It matters. People know things in some environments they don't know in others, weird as that sounds. So we need to try to capture all these variables in this system, in our system, and account for as many things as possible and isolate the impact that we're having. Finally, basic data science, regression analysis, getting up and running with regression analysis, maybe conditional means analysis. And we used for this just an Excel spreadsheet for grading, and then the statistical software R. We kind of got the basics of coding in R to interpret that data.
Yeah, so those programs that Professor Meyer just mentioned, Excel and R, are why it's so important to embed our daily collection, the data collection in our daily work. So this is something that we were careful to do. It's an improvement science principle or practice. So this enables us to actually use all the data that we collect. So grading point by point, assessment by assessment, piece by piece into Excel as we go throughout the semester. And so that way the spreadsheet is then formatted at the end of the semester. It's formatted in a way that R can read it, rather than ending up with just a pile of data, mountains of data entry to do at the end of each semester, which no one has time for. And then lastly, continuous iteration. Right? This is where the rubber hits the road with evidence-based practice, using that data that we collect and the research to guide our decision-making and our course design. So here's a quick example. I know we're coming up on our time, but here's a quick example of how our evidence-based practice principle of continuous iteration impacts our work. So on our second outcome that Chance was talking about, objective self-assessment, we discovered something really interesting. And that was that across 5 assessments that we gave, huge gains happened over the first 3 assessments, right? The first 2 was the difference in their over prediction of their score versus their earned score. And that third one there is where it jumped back down to being more realistic and more objective. But after that, there was hardly any value in the time that we spent, so there was diminishing or no returns after the third assessment. So we never would have thought this, right? Intuitively as teachers, we never would have thought this was the case. This is why we try to be evidence-based. We tend to intuitively think in ASP that more practice problems are better, right? If they're not doing well with essay practice, give them more essays to write, and that's better for all outcomes. But we were very surprised to see that that's not necessarily the case. And that freed us up in our redesign to allocate our time and to kind of reassess what we're doing in the course and working with our learners.
Yeah, so let me just give you very quickly, a few kind of insights we got from the data, how we interpreted it, how that feeds into our redesign, to give you an example of this cyclical process. One thing our data told us, this is people familiar with regression analysis this will be familiar. 38% of the variance in the outcome of GPA improvement was attributable to our activities in this course, those essays that Professor Noel just described. Not bad for predicting human behavior. I think we want to get that up. We want to get that up above 0.5. We want to have more than have to do with with our students' outcomes. But for now, we're happy with this. It tells us we don't need a huge overhaul. We just need to keep iterating. Here's an interesting one on our self-assessment variable: 10% for every 10% decrease in the difference between their self-score and their earned score. We expect a 0.14% increase in their third term GPA. That's huge. That tells us, yeah, metacognition is very closely related to improvement in performance. That tells us in our redesign, we want to get that self-assessment down, keep it down, make sure the students know the importance of that, because that's important as a learner to understand. Then finally, just interesting note here, an example of how we can be kind of our own barrier to our students' success. One of our essays, the second essay we give in the semester, was much more predictive of GPA improvement than the others, meaning some of the assessments we gave just weren't nearly as useful. We spent a lot of time on those, found out they weren't as useful. We never would have known this intuitively, by casual observation. Now we know. So over this summer, we're going to look at that rubric, look at that assessment, and ask, what is different about this? Why is this tapping into fundamental legal reasoning ability better than our other assessments? Something's going wrong. This is where our intuition as teachers comes in. The data can tell us what's working and what isn't, can't tell us what to do about it. We have to figure that out on our own, hopefully using our own wisdom as teachers. And also, it's really interesting to know here in the third week of the semester, we have something that's highly predictive of ultimate GPA. And we can use that to target interventions and, do messaging with our students, let them know where they stand and be more objective about that.
Yeah, so that's pretty much it. The most exciting thing about this for us is that we found it works. Our outcome measures are showing that we actually are getting better from year to year at improving our students' outcomes, at having an impact on student outcomes. So it's really exhilarating. There's so much purpose in the work, and it's really rewarding and kind of reassuring to be able to know when and where and how you are having an impact, and if you're not, to kind of course correct so that we can have the greatest impact for our students. So program evaluation becomes not just like making sure workers are working hard or sitting at their desk, but it becomes a really exciting process of continual improvement with measurable impact on student outcomes. So I know we've covered a lot today. I think we went a little bit over, so apologize for that. But if you're just getting started with evidence-based practice and you'd like to discuss things more, we eat, sleep, and breathe this stuff. We love talking about it. So by all means, please feel free to reach out to either or both of us. I think that Kamisha was going to drop our email addresses into the Q&A. I can't see if they are there, but if not, it's nnoel@nesl.edu, nesl.edu, and Chance is cmeyer, M-E-Y-E-R, @nesl.edu as well. So thank you so much for having us. It's been a real pleasure.
Great. Thank you, Nicole and Chance. Wonderful presentation. And we are, unfortunately, we only have a few moments for questions. There was just so much great content to cover in both of these presentations. Let me reiterate that attendees, please email our presenters, or you can contact us at Access Lex. You can contact me at research@accesslex.org, and I'll be happy either to answer your question directly or put you in touch with our presenters. I have several great questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them, but one that I want to, a couple actually that are related that I want to draw to everyone's attention are, one, how did you incentivize participation on the part of alumni and students? And two, what are some examples of the kinds of items that you use? Excuse me. Items meaning questions in your instruments. So I'm going to put that to all four of you, and please try and answer as briefly as you may, because we're almost done.
I'll go ahead and start. When we first submitted our proposal, we had money for travel and meals for our committee, but then COVID hit. So we worked with Access Lex to redirect that money to incentivize participation in the surveys with gift cards, basically. For the 2Ls, we have a coffee shop. And so, you know, we would give gift cards to the coffee shop. I think to the graduates, the 3Ls, like $10 Amazon card. So we were able to redirect the funds to do that.
Great, thank you. And if someone could please, actually this question was first addressed to Chris. Chris, could you briefly describe to us some examples of the items that you used? Were they Likert items? Were they just multiple choice? What did you use?
Sure. So most of them were Likert type items from established scales. So, you know, 1 being strongly agree and 5 being strongly disagree. There are a lot of questions like that. To what extent do you feel prepared for the bar exam? There were some open-ended questions, which, you know, sort of, you know, asking people to expand, you know, why this factor was the most important to you as you were preparing. So, yeah, so most of them were Likert type items, and then a few open response ones as well.
I'll add one more thing quickly. I'm
Okay.
sorry. Chris mentioned that we didn't have the data on the actual scores on the bar exam. We have arranged with the North Carolina Bar to submit consent forms from our graduates to get that data. So, you know, most jurisdictions, it's difficult to get the scores. So the board agreed that they would release it if the test taker gave us consent.
Thank you. I apologize for rushing everyone, but there's one more excellent question that I want to make sure gets some airtime, which is, how did you control for the effects of learning disability-related accommodations on the exams? Or, you know, if you didn't, do you have any plans to do that in the future? This is a really important question. I was just wondering if any of you have any immediate thoughts on that. Chris, I see you nodding your head, so I'm going to ask you.
Yeah, on the you know, in the surveys, we did ask questions about you know, disabilities, you know, including hidden disabilities as well, because many students have them. We also did ask questions, you know, the extent to which students believe that these disabilities interfered with their progress and so forth. So So we did capture that, and then when we do our analyses, yes, we will be able to control for those sorts of things and see if that population, indeed, how they're affected differently by these things. But yeah, we did include that, as well as some other demographics, with age and race and gender and kind of the standard slew of demographic type questions.
Wonderful. Thank you. Well, I want to thank Nicole, Noel, Chance Meyer, Chris Leopold, and Wendy Scott for their time. This was an excellent conversation. If you have any unanswered questions, or if you're simply curious about program assessment, please contact us at Access Lex. We love to talk about this stuff. We'll also be happy to put you in touch with our presenters today. Seriously, contact me, research@accesslex.org. Genuinely excited to talk about this with you. And a reminder to return to the attendee hub. And thank you everyone for your time, and have a great day.
Thanks so much.
Take care.